Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio. On this special cassette series of Reflections, Father Bacik discusses sexual ethics with Dr. Elizabeth Rice Allgaier, Assistant Professor of Psychology at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Here's Father Bacik.
Betsy, thank you for taking time out to come and talk with me on the program. I guess in one sense it's only fair because I did come into your class at the University of Bowling Green and your class on human sexuality and to give a presentation. In fact, you've had me in there a couple times, which I've appreciated.
And I'd like to take this opportunity to schedule you again for next term.
Well, that's not fair, Betsy. Let's negotiate after the program, okay? Not on the program. But anyway, we have had the chance to discuss a bit of these matters, and I have been impressed with the way you've dealt with your own class on sexuality, and therefore I would like to speak with you a little bit about these matters. And I guess I'm going to slant them in my own direction. I want to talk a bit about the morality of sexuality. And I know that you and I come from different backgrounds religiously and different worldviews and so on, which just might prove interesting in the discussion. But what I'm going to do is to use some material that's borrowed from a study on human sexuality that was done by the Catholic Theological Society of America, where they tried to talk a little bit about values that we would keep in mind in making decisions in the area of sexuality. In other words, when people are coming in to me to talk about sexual problems or questions and, about premarital sex with their boyfriends or homosexual relationships or questions of masturbation and people in marriage situations that aren't working out well and so on. I have to have some guidelines, it seems to me, some wisdom to share with them. I have to have something to say to them. And, there's one approach that has been taken which is very legalistic that says, hey, there's a sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, and that ought to cover it. Fornication is out, masturbation is out. Those things are all against God's law, so don't do them. Now, that's one approach that is often taken in religious circles, and it seems to have certain defects in it. For one thing, it doesn't seem to respect the intelligence of the people involved. And secondly, it doesn't seem to be very effective. In other words, people these days don't seem to do things just because an authority figure tells them not to do them or to do them. There is that ambivalence of the human heart that often takes them in another direction. And there's the cultural fact that people by and large tend to mistrust large institutions or long-standing traditions and so on. So that legalistic approach doesn't seem to be very good at all. I wonder if, before I ramble on here forever, if do you run into people yet who are caught in that kind of trap, or who you talk to in your classes come out of religious traditions where it is put to them in those kinds of legalistic black and white terms? Are you still finding that?
Yes, and one of the things that I think is very difficult is, and this, my vantage point here comes out of my training as a psychologist, is the failure to distinguish between feelings and acts. Remember, we talked about Playboy in the last program. Remember when Jimmy Carter gave his famous statement that he has lusted in his heart after other women. And I have heard or read more noise about that than about John Kennedy's decision or his practice of acting on those feelings. And I think it's very important that we make a distinction between what we feel, because the feelings are free.
Yes.
We do not choose our feelings, and
That's
therefore
right.
we can enjoy those and our fantasies and so forth. The big issue is what we decide.
The actions, the decisions,
To
the
do.
behavior,
The
yes.
behavior, yes.
I mean, there was a lot of talk about a papal statement along that same line that the Pope made in an audience, and the precise words don't come to me, but it was about husbands lusting after their wives, and which out of the framework that we know could make a lot of sense. A lot of people were very upset with that statement, but as you would well recognize from your own background, it is very possible in marital relationships to use it to somehow subjugate the other person. I think the real meaning of the Pope was that somehow that a husband was not supposed to be using his wife as a sex object, that he was not supposed to be using it as a way of dominating the woman in his life, and so on, and that he was making a plea for some mutuality. Now, it didn't come out that way, and when people heard the statement, they were very upset. Well, I was just picking up on some of your remarks there, that one needs to hear these in a proper context. And you wanted to distinguish, I know, behavior from thoughts and fantasies.
And further, I think it's very unfortunate that he used the term lust. Lust, to me, translates passion, and it seems to me one of the great pleasures involved in my own relationship with my husband is the passion that exists sometimes. That's wonderful. And I would be very sad if that were to go.
You think that's the way the average person heard lust, was in terms of passion?
Yes, and I think that you are providing a corrective there. I'm not sure the Pope would agree with you, but providing a corrective in suggesting that the use of sex or the abuse of sex to dominate or control or manipulate another individual is the problem.
I do think that in this case that is what he intended to say, but we're really not into a question of defense of the papal statements, are we? We're trying to get at this morality question, and you have made a really good point there. And that I didn't say right just a minute ago, I think. You distinguish acts from fantasies and desires. You made the point that what is in one's fantasy or imagination is often just there. It's a given. It's a fact. And that needs to be distinguished from acting out these particular things. And I think that's absolutely vital, especially in our Catholic tradition. You see, there's some Catholics who would think that to even have sexual thoughts is in itself wrong, that it's sinful to have sexual fantasies, whereas, as I often say, the mind is really not like a window that can be just closed off, and you kind of pull the drapes and stop things from coming in somehow. It just doesn't function like that. So your point is well taken in the light of the religious tradition as I would know it.
Well, and the danger, too, of equating feelings and acts is that it does not provide the opportunity for the individual to examine a range of feelings and to select from among those feelings which he or she will carry into behavior, so that you get sometimes extraordinarily religious people having had a fantasy. They've already therefore sinned, and so they can go ahead and carry out abysmal kinds of acts because they haven't learned that there's a huge difference between one's fantasies and feelings and what one does to another human being.
Very perceptive comment coming from another perspective. You yourself not working out of a traditional religious Christian framework, and to see that, I find that to be very insightful, and another good reason for distinguishing those two things out. Yes. Okay, I'm trying to say that, someone's coming into me with these problems. I can't just give them a legalism these days. I can't just say don't do it because there's a law against it. And it seems to me, on the other hand, we can't simply leave people say, well, if it feels good, do it. If you want it, go ahead. Maximize pleasure at the expense of other people, and so on. You know, who cares about others? Do the loving thing. That's one of the phrases that comes out of the literature that we know as situation ethics, which is do the loving thing. Well, if someone comes into my room and says, you know, they're trying to figure out how to handle their relationship before they're married sexually, and I say simply to them, do the loving thing, I don't think I've served them very well. I've told them not to be selfish, which would really be good, but I think they need more enlightenment than that and more help. And that's where I get now to the grist of what we wanted to talk about, and that is to look through some of the value suggestions, the principles that have been provided for us in my own framework out of the Catholic Theological Society. And let me mention these, and as I do them, then maybe you want to comment on them or see if they ring true to you or how you would say them and so on, okay? So the first one they talk about is that it ought to be self-liberating. Sexual activity of any sort ought to be self-liberating. That somehow there's self-interest involved in this, that sexuality has to do with our own growth process, that it has to do with maturation and becoming more the kind of persons that we really want to be. I could think of an activity that this would rule out, something that we see a lot in the university situation, I think. That is, say that a woman would have sex with a young man, not married, so as not to lose him. Now, what I would say is happening there is that she is enslaving herself. She's not really liberating herself. That sexual activity would be ruled out on that basis, or she would be going against that value. It's not liberating at all. She's just becoming a thing or getting used. She's putting herself in danger of being hurt a great deal. So I guess what it is important here to see is that our sexuality ought to help us to overcome our enslavements. It's the drive and force that moves us out of ourselves, that gets us over our selfishness and attunes us to the needs of another person. It is a unifying type force, and therefore ought to be used in that way.
Yes, and it seems to me that one of the there's an interesting paradox here, that in being aware of oneself, in focusing on what one feels and what kinds of things feel good, and then in sharing that information with a loved one, giving the loved one information and power to make one feel good, is to give the other person a real gift, because it is a wonderful thing to be able to pleasure another person and know that you are making that person feel good. So that in being selfish, or I think you used the term self-love in an earlier conversation we had, one is simultaneously giving the gift of oneself to another person.
Yeah, I like that idea. I often put it in terms, I think the same insight of saying that we give a great gift to others by allowing them to love us.
Yes.
That because that's the only way we can come to any self-actualization ourselves, if there's someone who allows us to love them. Because we need to love. We need to get out of ourselves, to break the imprisonment of selfishness. So that is a wonderful gift when we allow others to love us. I think that probably happens in simple ways, just by allowing compliments to come in instead of screening them out. Or of responding with some sort of intimate conversation if other people want to talk at that level. Yes. And of course, and that would go on then. I mean, if we look at a marriage situation, it's so important to see that, how allowing the partner to love one would be the thing that would free them up.
Yes.
Self-liberating. Okay, Betsy, let's go on to the next, because I got 7 of these things that I want to talk about here, and we'll keep same format, I think, commenting on them. What we're trying to do is say, work out a sexual morality in general, or put very concretely, if someone comes in for advice to me on sexual matters, what am I going to tell them? Values to guide them, instead of just saying, don't do this, and on the other hand, do whatever you feel like doing. The second one is that it be other enriching, or that it somehow enable the other person to grow and to develop. I guess this would be the opposite of trying to manipulate and control, that where sexuality would become a conquest or a way of trying to keep another in some sort of dominated or subjugated state. I guess that's usually happened in terms of males dominating women, but I think we're seeing a little bit of swing on that these days. And as you and I know from the university scene, things are switching around a little bit there. But this kind of activity, I think, would rule out, the one-night stands where the other person isn't thought of. The usual situation we've got in a university town where they go downtown and a guy picks up a gal and they have intercourse the first night, and he doesn't care about her. He promises to call her the next day and never does, and she doesn't see him anymore. And then before long, she's in my office saying, I gave myself to him and it meant nothing to him. He used me. I was used. I feel foolish. That's a common thing I hear. I feel foolish because I gave myself. Well, I would say the activity of the young man in that situation was hardly other enriching. In other words, he wasn't thinking about her growth and her development and what this might end up meaning to her. And I slanted the example because I think it usually happens that way, but unfortunately I see the thing shifting at times in terms of male-female. But go ahead, why don't you make your comment?
Well, I was just going to say that you're describing a situation in which I don't believe that the description that the young woman is giving you is a particularly accurate one. I believe it's very difficult for a person to give of himself or herself to someone they've just met. It takes a long time for most human beings to develop enough trust in another person that they could truly give themselves. She may have put her genitals next to him, but that's totally different from giving of oneself.
You really think that? I mean, I guess over the years, I've usually made this distinction in the counseling. It's often seemed to me that men could do that in a way, that they were able to make that kind of distinction and say, this is just a genital sexual activity.
So can women.
You're going to stick with that.
I know that experience.
Well, I certainly have heard many women describe it otherwise, that they would, and I think the language that I was using would really represent an awful lot of women that I have heard say that.
I believe
that quickly, that the physical activity of having intercourse was a giving of self. I've seldom run into women who, in their minds or their language, distinguish those two things.
I agree with what you're saying in the sense that I don't believe they distinguish them, but I believe that in the failure to distinguish them, the notion that one is giving oneself by giving one's genitals is not a particularly accurate one. We don't trust that quickly, we human beings, by and large. And the other thing I would comment on from that, your same general point there, is you've talked a lot about the domination of men by women, but there has also been, for an equally lengthy period of time, presumably, the domination, the attempt to dominate and manipulate by women insofar as they engage in sex, not because they are feeling moved to express their love with physical intimacy with their partner, but instead because they want to control their partner into having a relationship with them. That's an attempt to manipulate and dominate.
So it can cut both ways.
Women do it as well as men.
And as you point out, it's historically happened. It just seems to be more clearly moving in that direction to me now, I guess. I just become more aware of the fact that women end up doing it, and men will be feeling that very often, feeling used or manipulated or controlled.
Sure.
Yes. I hear more of that now than, say, I heard 10 years ago. I know that.
I think what I'm trying to suggest is we've used two different kinds of modes.
Yes.
Men straight domination, scoring, etc.
Yes.
Women, if I go to bed with them, then I may be able to get them to marry me.
To get them,
or whatever.
Oh, well, we know the young women who get pregnant on purpose.
Right.
Very strange phenomenon, but true. Betsy, the third thing here, that that this activity should be honest. And what I mean by that is that it should express in a truthful way the depth and the commitment that the relationship has achieved. That that the physical expression is congruent with the personal involvement, that the genital expression is in accord with what people are feeling emotionally and with the kinds of commitment that they have for one another. Now, again, that would rule out, it seems to me, certain clear activities. On the one hand, it would say that people, when they first get to know one another, should not have sexual intercourse because it simply isn't honest. It doesn't reflect the commitment that can be there yet. It just can't develop that quickly. And on the other hand, it would suggest that people who are engaged can't be expected to be 2 feet apart all the time. That there has to be a certain degree of physical involvement that they have that gives honest expression to the commitment and the depth of love that they have achieved in their relationship. Now, in between, you're going to find a lot of gray areas and a lot of arguments, and the couple's going to have a lot of trouble deciding a lot of times the amount of physical intimacy that makes sense. But I would uphold the general principle that it should be honest. In that sense, maybe authentic is a word. That the physical activity really expresses what is going on in the personal relationship.
And it was on that basis that on the basis of that value, that I made the comment about the young woman's description of having given herself. I, again, would suggest that it is very difficult for an individual to meet another individual in one evening and be able to feel enough trust that one really is giving oneself.
Yes,
and so there is a lack of authenticity. I would not, however, take the position that it is impossible that two people could meet and have a mutually satisfying sexual experience, but it's, in a given evening. But the chances of two individuals wanting precisely the same thing, and with neither trying to get something else out of the other, are very minimal.
That would be a rare occasion in your mind.
Occasion, yes. But
okay.
Can happen.
Fourth point is that it be faithful, that there be a consistent pattern of interest and concern for the other person, and that this of course would be the kind of thing we would associate with marriage. Finally, that kind of fidelity that says two people are committing themselves for their whole life. They're going to walk down the path of life together. They intend to remain interested in one another through thick and thin. They're going to try to work it out. Fidelity like that. What we would expect is that fidelity would gradually grow in a relationship. And again, the amount of physical expression would seem to have to be related to that kind of fidelity that is achieved. Again, if I try to play that out, I mean, we could see that what happens very often is that people would claim more fidelity than they've really shown in any length of time. So we see young people saying to one another, well, I love you, when they're nowhere near love. They're in some other kind of state. Maybe it might be called infatuation. And it simply doesn't have the consistency. They haven't proven it over a period of time. It doesn't possess that kind of fidelity. Remember what you did in your class. I'm trying to watch the time here, but where you made all the listing of things where people who were insane or deviant behavior, and then compared it.
Yes, I asked them to write down. I asked them if they'd ever known anybody who they considered to be mentally or emotionally disturbed, and then I asked them to write to tell me what were the behaviors that they associated with that. And then I scratched out the mentally disturbed and put in love.
In love,
and
right.
The class gradually reads through the list and laughs because
yes, I was in that class when you did that. It was a very interesting reaction. But it shows, again, the rationalization, the way one could fool oneself. That's why fidelity is important.
Yes.
Fifth one is socially responsible. That is, that somehow the behavior reflects the responsibility to family, to one's religious tradition, to the whole human community. I mean, that would, in my mind, for example, rule out bringing children into the world that one couldn't care for. It would mean regulating the number of children that one would have within marriage. It would suggest that. It would suggest that young people ought to think about their religious traditions when they make decisions about premarital sex, for example. They ought to think about their family's feelings about it. A lot of times I find myself, young people saying, well, should we live together or not? And I don't think, I think they should think of what their parents are going to think about that. That could devastate their parents, for example, and maybe there's no good reason or no cause for that. So, again, do you want to respond to that, Betsy?
Very, very briefly, yeah. I'm aware right now of a situation going on where parents who have not communicated about sexuality to their children as they were growing up are very upset that their children are making decisions about which they disapprove. And families can get devastated by the choices of young people, but sometimes they would have avoided that devastation had they been discussing sexual matters with their kids.
Surely dialogue would have helped all the way along the line. But at a given historical situation, I sometimes find myself telling the young people, hey, you must think of this. This is a value that you ought to consider along with your religious tradition. Again, because it's so easy to get narrowed on sexual matters, to get so caught up in it, that one needs a wider tradition. That's what seems to me to be valuable about religious traditions. The sixth one is that the sexual activity would be life-serving. That somehow, that for married people, that it would be enriching to one another, that in a proper setting it would bring children into the world. For people who are not married, it might suggest that they not just sit around and feel sorry for themselves, that single people don't just think they're ruled out of this world because they don't have a close, intimate relationship right now, that their own sexuality should propel them towards serving others, doing for others. I suppose that's what a celibate clergy ought to be trying to do, to be involved in a life of service. So that, again, would seem to be valuable. You got a quick comment?
I'm going to ask you more questions about celibacy at another time.
Okay. Maybe that's just as well. And the other value is that we wanted to talk about, the seventh one, is that it's joyous. That there's a spontaneity about the sex, that it just doesn't have to conform to expectations, or that people shouldn't feel like they're machines operating. I think that's, some people have said, more sexual activity but less real pleasure.